the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Welcome to the Fall 2023 Sustainability Seminar Series. So we have put together an excellent slate of speakers this semester, like previous semesters. Those of you who are taking the seminar for credit and were present in the class last week, you have already seen the syllabus. I discussed it there. So, and those of you who haven't checked the syllabus yet, it is in Canvas. Check. If you have any questions, let me know, email me. So all our speakers have kindly agreed to stay behind after the seminars until 6:25 or so to chat with you. So use this opportunity to network with the best minds in sustainability, and maybe some of them can become your industry mentors down the road in capstone projects. After the seminar today, Khalid will open a breakout room where you can interact with Amanda. To attend, you have to be a sustainability management student or enroll for credit in the seminar course this semester. So today's seminar is sponsored by one of the joint sponsors of the seminar series, Geocentech Consultants. My good friend and a senior principal from Geocentech, George Hollerbach, is here today, and he will introduce today's speaker. George?
Okay, thank you, Debs. Welcome back to school. I'm sure everyone's enjoying this nice, beautiful fall weather today. I don't know how it is in Pittsburgh, Amanda, but I'm pleased to introduce one of my colleagues from Geocentech, Amanda McNally. She's a senior engineer in our Pittsburgh office, and I've been very fortunate enough to actually work with Amanda on a few projects. So I've really enjoyed working with her in her office, some of her colleagues in Pittsburgh, and so it's a pleasure to have her join this webinar series. Amanda will be speaking on sustainable remediation. It's an interesting topic. I can tell you from past experience and being, having over 40 years experience when we started working on large remediation sites, sustainability, looking at greenhouse gases, the way you clean up sites was not necessarily really focused on it all. In fact, I recall, getting some records of decision signed with EPA. There was never a consideration for CO2 emissions and how much energy you were using for remediation. So it's nice to see that sustainable practices of sustainability is implemented into remediation. So with that, I'll pass it on to Amanda. Again, she's going to talk basically about a lot of her experience on large sites. So give it over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Appreciate the introduction. So as George mentioned, I'm going to talk about sustainable remediation and environmental, social, and governance today, and how the kind of the broader sustainability and ESG concepts are incorporated into the remediation practice, which is my main area of focus in my role at Geosyntec. So we'll go through introduction. I've got my slide and biography here, which George touched on. And then we'll talk about some definitions, make sure that we're on the same page about ESG and sustainability. And then some background on sustainable remediation, kind of where that field of study has progressed over the last decade and a half or so. And then some approaches and tools that I have used in my work. And then we'll circle back to ESG and touch on some of the ESG reporting frameworks and specifically the SEC climate-related disclosure rules that are emerging. So as George said, I'm a civil engineer in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania office of Geosyntec. I earned my BS in civil engineering at Case Western Reserve University and my MS in environmental engineering and science at Johns Hopkins University. I'm licensed in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and my primary focus in my career has been site assessment and remediation. And then over the last 5 years or so, focusing on environmental compliance and permitting. And throughout that time, I've been developing expertise on sustainable remediation frameworks and evaluation of remediation alternatives. So at a very high level, thinking about sustainability and ESG, these are terms that we hear very frequently in whether it's in media or popular news articles or in classes that you're enrolled in at Stevens. Sustainability is the concept of meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that goes back to the Brundtland Convention in the 80s. And so the concepts have been around for a very long time. ESG is a set of quantifiable and measurable factors that are used to evaluate sustainability and identify risks and also provide non-performance data. And those are being used across the industry in the financial sector primarily to look at the value of companies and the how sustainable they are compared to the claims they make about their sustainability. So if you think about sustainability as the way you behave as a company, ESG is how you monitor and measure that. And then indicating how your company or organization is impacting or is being affected by the environment. There are various frameworks for reporting and options for what types of information is reported by companies and different organizations. Those reports may be in response to investor expectations, may be required to retain access to lenders and insurance and markets, but also it's a way of improving your operational efficiency and how effective you are in your role as a company, whatever that company or organization may have an objective to achieve. It's expected by employees and potential employees and customers of companies as consumers are becoming more conscious. They're wanting to do business with companies that have these things in mind. So under the environmental, social, and governance components of ESG, we consider things like carbon emissions, compliance with environmental regulations, habitat. On the social side, safety and security, human resources, procurement, diversity, equity, and inclusion. On the governance side, we're thinking in terms of transparency and ethics, cybersecurity, risk reduction, executive management of an organization, and how that trickles down throughout the organization. So was looking a bit at the Sustainability Management Master's Program site and excerpted a few pieces here. This was a very true statement. The world's largest companies are discovering that what's good for the environment is good for business. As I said, it's sustainability goals, objectives, ESG metrics are expected by not only financial reporting organizations, but expected by investors and companies and customers and suppliers. And so just taking a peek at some of the large companies, these are companies that my company is a consultant to, and the companies that we go after work for, and just any number of these companies, you look at their websites and they have sustainability goals and targets established in various components of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, how they expect themselves to perform as a company, and how they're holding themselves accountable. So Dow, chemical manufacturer, ExxonMobil, oil and gas company, all of these companies are making statements about sustainability. Waste management, another example. They're providing information in a sustainability report. Some of that information includes things like greenhouse gas emissions, waste generation, water use, their role in communities, and how they're governed as an organization. And the intent of ESG reporting is to provide quantifiable metrics that can actually track how those companies are performing against the stated goals that they publish. So, as I said, my main role within my career, my focus has been on environmental remediation and investigation. So, on one hand, cleaning up the environment through remediation of past contamination of our land and water and other resources is on one hand, there's a vision that it's inherently sustainable. However, a lot of the practices, George just mentioned this, back into the 80s and 90s in terms of how we were approaching remediation, whether that would be digging up a site and disposing of the soil in a landfill, or installing a very large pump and treat system that would pump groundwater out of the subsurface, treat it through external ex situ treatment system, and discharge to the sewer, removing that resource from the earth, and also a very energy intensive process to do so. Those are very common approaches and still are to some degree. But as companies lean toward sustainable approaches and are required to conduct more ESG reporting and publish their sustainability vision for their companies, we have looked at sustainability and how can remediation work support this vision, and how can we incorporate the components of sustainability evaluation into our remediation work. So another definition of sustainability here, which I'm going to kind of show some progression here of sustainable remediation. So sustainability is creating and maintaining conditions under which humans and nature can exist in harmony that permit the fulfilling of social, economic, and other requirements, which is similar to what we discussed at the very outset of this presentation. On the other hand, when you focus in on remediation, this definition is from the Sustainable Remediation Forum in the United Kingdom. They're an organization that is focused on developing tools and resources and encouraging the use of sustainability concepts in remediation, mostly in the United Kingdom, but they've been very involved on the international scale as well. But they practice with demonstrating in terms of environmental, economic, and social indicators, and we'll talk about what some of those indicators may be, that the benefit of undertaking the remediation is greater than its impact, and the optimum remediation solution is selected through the use of a balanced decision-making process. There's a few things I wanted to call out within that definition. So obviously there's the environmental, economic, and social indicators. That's kind of the three stools of the three legs of the sustainability stool, which is in parallel to the ESG concepts we've mentioned. But the next component is that looking at the overall benefit of undertaking remediation. So when I gave an example of a dig and haul or an excavation disposal project or a pump and treat system that is very energy intensive, those are just some very basic examples where you're spending a lot of energy to reduce risk to human health and the environment. And a balanced sustainable remediation approach is going to look at the energy and resources and the impacts of the work being done compared to the environmental benefit or broader than environment, the societal benefit of conducting that remediation in the first place. Are you really achieving a reasonable amount of environmental improvement, reduction of risk, health to human receptors and the environment to justify the resources used in that remediation effort? And the last important piece of that definition is the balanced decision-making process. So in any decision, whether remediation or otherwise, there's always going to be trade-offs. When you decide to do one thing, you're deciding not to do something else. And so the impacts of the decisions that we make about site management inevitably have trade-offs. And understanding those trade-offs is a critical part of making a sustainable decision and approaching the remediation of a site in a sustainable manner. The timeline here, I won't go into detail about each of these items, but the timeline shows over the last 20 years or so how the concepts of sustainable remediation have progressed. From the founding of several organizations in the US and UK focused on sustainable remediation to guidance documents published by US EPA, ITRC, ASTM, the Department of Defense, and the development of various tools for evaluating the sustainability metrics associated with remediation. Some of those by Department of Defense agencies, some of those by EPA, some of those by individual companies or individuals working with their clients. So why is sustainability evaluation important? We've talked about kind of the origin of some of the sustainability concepts, but even over the last 10 years or so, EPA has rolled out several policies. The National Research Council has advised the EPA back to 2014 to consider stakeholder communication and the impacts of remediation activities on local communities and various stakeholders. Various executive orders, which of course were then later rescinded, but those triggered a lot of work within the sustainable remediation sector that trickled down from federal agencies down to their supply chain, which includes a lot of federal contractors, federal defense contractors, and then of course to their consultants. So the environmental consultants working within in the industry to develop remediation approaches were being held to the same standards that these federal agencies were in terms of implementing sustainable strategies on their projects. So a typical sustainable remediation assessment process, and I'll start just a typical assessment process for site remediation. When you have contaminated land that is impacted from historical industrial activities or spills or whatever the case may be, we are often looking at different remediation alternatives, different technologies that can be used to remediate that site. And when we're looking at those alternatives, we are looking at cost estimates. How much do each of these alternatives cost? How long is it going to take? What is the timeline for construction of this remediation activity? Are we excavating a site and disposing the material in a landfill? Are we building an engineered approach that contains the material in place? Or are we instituting a pump and treat technology where we would extract groundwater or other contaminated media from the subsurface and treat it above ground? So when we're looking at those alternatives, we're comparing alternatives based on a set number of criteria. And we'll talk about what the regulatory criteria are next. But in terms of a sustainable remediation process, we have to look at a lot of indicators, including risk reduction. Are we reducing the risk of exposure to human health and the environment from contaminants on that site? Whether we're looking at chlorinated compounds, fuel-related compounds, or as we're seeing more and more these days, PFAS compounds or forever chemicals. and understanding the risk of those chemicals in the environment to human and other receptors. As we think more holistically about the site, beyond are we reducing risk and how much does it cost, there's also other impacts that we would want to consider. Things like recreational access, business disturbance, ecological value. What is the ecosystem in which this site is operating, and what value does that provide in a broader sense? We look at establishing a scoring approach for each of those metrics that we are to consider. How are we going to score it? We can quantify a lot of these metrics, things like risk reduction and cost. Some are better suited to semi-quantitative analysis, such as percent or ranges. I don't have details in this presentation, but I'll give an example. Recreational access. There was a site we were evaluating. It was a sediment remediation site where millions of cubic yards of dredged material was to be dredged from the river, and that it was an urban riverfront area that had a lot of recreational uses as well as industrial and commercial uses. But one of the primary concerns of the stakeholders at this site was recreational access to the river during and after construction. With millions of cubic yards of dredging proposed to remediate this site, we looked at a percent of the recreational access points on the river that would be impacted by the remediation at some point during construction. And so that was a way we were able to provide a semi-quantitative number rather than just a straight a number or a cost associated with different alternatives. And then some metrics we are considering more at a qualitative level, high, medium, or low. Red light, yellow light, green light, or happy face, sad face in some frameworks. Those things can, something like community acceptance is often well suited to a qualitative scoring approach because you have a lot of different stakeholders that have a lot of different personal criteria for how well they were to accept a remediation approach decision and whether they agree with it. So often that's a high, medium, low is a better way to approach that scoring system. And then finally, conducting an analysis. So once we've selected the indicators and we've established how we're going to score those indicators, we are then comparing our remediation alternatives using those indicators and the scores, and also looking at the stakeholder values that are weighing into those decisions. So it's a very complex process there, and I have some examples later on in this presentation, and we'll get into how that analysis is done and how I've used it on a few different projects, and how we can range from a simple analysis all the way down to a complex analysis, and how those can be used to provide stakeholder communication. So as we talk about the different indicators or metrics that we're using to evaluate remediation, I want to harken back to EPA, CERCLA, the National Priorities List. When the sustainability or the Superfund program, was established, written into the regulations are the selection criteria that EPA is required to use when selecting a remediation alternative. And there are 9 criteria, and you can see them there on the middle of the screen. Protection of human health and the environment, compliance with ARARs, which are sets of laws and regulations that a remediation approach must meet. Long-term effectiveness and permanence, reduction of toxicity, mobility, or volume through treatment, short-term effectiveness, implementability. Microsoft Word does not like that, but it is written into the regulations. Cost, state agency acceptance, and community acceptance. So written into our federal regulations are these 9 criteria that are supposed to be used to select a remediation alternative under Superfund. And so EPA often applies those does apply those across remediation programs. And when we look at different state frameworks as well, at state regulatory agencies, their criteria for selecting a remediation alternative will often mirror these 9 criteria. So looking at the timeline of this, these were established in the 80s. This is a guidance document published in 1990. And as we have progressed into this sustainability and ESG era, there are a lot of other indicators that are increasingly important. So as we look at remediation sites, the 2 references that I have linked here are the US EPA has a greener cleanups program, which takes additional environmental indicators, including air, energy, materials and waste, land and ecosystems, and water, and using those within the circular framework to support design of remediation alternatives or design of remediation activities that can have a lower impact on the environment. Now that's used by EPA to try and reduce the impacts, and that was their response to executive orders that required consideration of environmental footprint. So EPA's environmental footprint themselves is the operation of their buildings and their labs. However, the work that they can impact is much broader than that. So this was how they built out their focus on the environmental aspect of sustainability to encourage remediation activities that had low impacts. On the left side of the screen is an example from an ASTM guide for integrating sustainable objectives into cleanup. And you'll notice that these go beyond the environmental aspect to include environmental, social, and economic indicators, such as local community vitality, community involvement, local impacts to the local economy, considering things like jobs and efficiencies, land and ecosystems, energy, air emissions, enhancement of individual human environments. So there's a lot more that can be brought into the remediation discussion. And outside of, again, I'll back up, outside of these 9 criteria, there is very rarely a fixed set of sustainability criteria that should be considered. So it's very open-ended. There is a lot of guidance. There are a lot of options to consider. And so working with our clients, we're often tailoring a remediation evaluation to what is important for that client and the stakeholders in which who they're working with at a given site. So in addition to thinking about which indicators we would include in a sustainable remediation evaluation, we also need to consider the level of effort, how complex our evaluation needs to be. And I like to say that the assessment should only be as complex as needed. The purpose of doing a sustainability assessment for a remediation project is to make a decision. So understanding what is the decision that needs to be made and what information do you need to make that decision in a well-informed manner. So if you're looking to select between 2 remediation alternatives and they're very easy to compare, you may not need to do as much data collection and evaluation if that decision is going to be much more simple. However, a more complex site where you may have multiple environmental media such as groundwater, soil, or sediment, a site where you may have hundreds of stakeholders involved in the cleanup process, from various site owners to community groups to business groups who are utilizing the land to government agencies, it becomes a lot more complex, and different indicators and criteria may be important to different stakeholders. And some of those metrics and indicators may be able to be quantified, some may be more qualitative. So at that level, you may be combining different approaches to come up with the right framework and the right level of effort to conduct a sustainability analysis. And so the intent of the graphic that you see here is to show that there's tiered approaches. And so if we think about this in terms of all projects, you can implement best management practices or sustainable management practices. You can reduce idling of vehicles. You can reduce waste disposal, minimize energy or wasting of energy, and things like that. Different strategies that you can employ at sites to accomplish some environmental goals. However, as you do more complex analysis, depending on the complexity of the site, you have more and more tools in your toolbox. So I have, there's a lot of content here. And I've presented this with different audiences, and I know this group does not have a specific remediation background, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on this. But the important part of this is speaking about some of the tiered analyses, and it maps to some of the examples that I'll show in a couple of more slides. We were trying to find some criteria to determine what tools we should use, how we should do our quantitative analysis, and how much effort should be spent for simple analyses all the way down to complex analyses. So the intent of my presentation is not to get into the weeds of specific remediation sites, but rather to show that there's a range of options when we're looking at doing a sustainability assessment of how much data we need to go out and collect, how many stakeholders we will go out and speak to, of how much quantitative analysis we're conducting in the office, and what level of communication we're providing to clients and stakeholders and regulators regarding the analyses that we've completed. So this graphic boils down I think you can probably see my mouse here, the right side of the screen, talking about tool examples, and then on the tiered approach, when we might select them for use on various sites. So on the left-hand side here, we're ranging in the complexity of the assessment from a simple technology comparison. If we would be comparing a sediment dredging alternative to a sediment capping alternative, we might use our expert judgment based on site criteria and understanding of site characteristics that dredging would be more effective or capping might be more feasible at a given site. As we progress, we are looking to optimize a remediation alternative using best management practices, BMPs, or we're combining remedies. So often for sediment remediation, we'll combine remediation alternatives and include some amount of dredging or capping or enhanced natural recovery, which would be adding a carbon amendment into the sediment to promote remediation of that material. We might work across a broad group of stakeholders. I was involved in a project where we went out in the community and attended community group meetings and did a literature review of different stakeholder organizations, business groups, industry groups in the city in which this remediation was occurring, and gathered information from different stakeholders to determine how they might approach the remediation, what our client needed to be aware of as they move down the remediation path and negotiation with the agencies. We've also done regional assessment on that same project. We did an economic modeling exercise where we looked at the regional impact of remediation activities and the costs, not only the cost of the remediation being completed, but how that would impact jobs, how that would affect the gross regional product of the region in which the remediation was occurring, and how different financing options of that work would impact those outcomes. Now, that was for a very large, complex, long-term project, and that was a very, very expensive, complex model. So we matched the complexity of the tools we were using to the complexity and needs of the site. The benefits of using a lower level of technology of tools is that they're lower cost, they're simple, they're transparent, they're easy to explain to a group of stakeholders. However, on the negative side, they may not provide the level of detail that you might need to make an informed decision. And while the more complex tools can be higher cost and they're data intensive, they require a lot of inputs and a lot of assumptions, they can also better reflect stakeholder values. So you're much better able to reflect the interests of a community by going out and collecting a lot of data and information about that community and how it might affect the remediation of a site. So this slide shows an example of how we might walk through that, from what is an indicator, what is the metric, and how are we quantifying it. So hopefully the progression of these slides have shown a couple different examples of that, even though it's a very niche analysis, a niche area of analysis. So when we're looking at environmental, economic, and social metrics, we're going to, from the environment category, we're going to take the resilience criteria that was used for this analysis. Within the resilience criteria, there are several indicators that would describe the resilience of a project. So resilience, by definition, is the ability of a system, in this case, a remediation system, to withstand the changes associated with climate change, the physical and natural changes that would be inflicted on a given area. Those could be things related to floods or fires or hurricane impacts that, of course, are changing with the climate. So some of the indicators within the resilience category would be things like recontamination. If you have more frequent freeze-thaw cycles or more frequent storms, what is the risk of recontaminating your site with previously remediated or previously contained contaminants? How well is that material being attenuated? Often a remediation relies on natural attenuation or natural breakdown of contaminants, and that may change with the changing environment. Vulnerability and disturbance. Vulnerability is how vulnerable a given site is to climate change impacts. So is it a low-lying site near a coastline, or is it in a dry area that is prone to fire risks? And then disturbance, of course, how much disturbance do we have on the shorelines of a given remediation project? How much work are we doing to remediate a site versus the work needed to maintain that site long term? And so then we use various metrics to quantify those indicators. Looking at our upstream inputs of contamination versus our cleanup goals for the site, which are usually regulatory driven. Looking at volumes of remediation. For example, if we were doing a capping alternative, which places an impermeable cap over contaminated sediment, we would be looking at the volume of material left in place at risk of being remobilized due to a severe storm event, for example. So this is just one example of all of the indicators that you see listed in the example circle framework here from cost effectiveness, jobs, infrastructure. This was pulled from an example framework for each one of those criteria. We identified the indicators and then identified metrics. And as you can imagine, that becomes very complicated to then quantify each one of those and then incorporate that into a multi-criteria analysis. So the next 3 slides, I'm going to go through some example metrics or some example outputs from sustainability evaluations. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. There's a lot of detail that has gone into these slides. I'm happy to chat more about them. I don't want to spend too much of our time today going into too much detail on these, but I just wanted to share some examples of how we've used sustainability assessment to communicate our evaluation of remediation projects. This simple example takes a single criteria. It's on the x-axis is percent SWAC reduction, which is surface weighted average concentration. So it's a metric used in sediment remediation to estimate the amount of reduction of contaminants in the surface. And then on the y-axis is the dollars per percentage point of SWAC reduction. So how much additional money are you spending for each percent of reduction in your contaminant at the site? And so the A, B, C, D, and E are different remediation alternatives that include differing levels of sediment removal or sediment remediation. And the intent of this graph is to find the knee in the curve, or the place where the cost, the incremental cost to clean up an incremental amount of contaminant becomes unreasonable. So at these lower percentages, the incremental cost to clean up between 15 to 20% is much lower than as you get into the 25 to 30% reduction in SWAC. That is a much more expensive alternative for the amount of remediation. It's the bang for your buck. This example is a multi-criteria analysis where we separated out the indicators into beneficial and adverse impacts. So beneficial impacts were things like contaminant mass removal from the site, job creation, wages, worker safety, things like that. The adverse impacts were things like greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutant emissions, energy use, construction time, and we scored and normalized those to a common scale, and then aggregated these to show a total benefit score, both in the beneficial and adverse categories. And what was important to note with this evaluation, which of course is from a different site than the previous slide, so we have different remediation options here. Alternative C was our most expensive alternative, which you can see with the black dot at the top of the screen. But across all 4 of these alternatives, each of these alternatives achieved approximately the same amount of beneficial impact. The benefits to the environment and the communities that we were looking at received the same amount of benefit no matter how much remediation was conducted, whereas the adverse impacts only increased with the cost of the remediation. So we were achieving less bang for your buck, if you will, when the bang includes various metrics across the environmental, social, and economic spectrum. And then finally, I could talk about this chart for an hour, but I will try to avoid that. I'll back up a couple of slides just to have you recall this Venn diagram here, the environmental, economic, and social. Each of those criteria, this framework was used to develop this chart, whereas all of the green shaded cells with various hatching are environmental indicators. The blue, the various blue hatched are the economic, and the pink and red are the social indicators. In a similar manner to the previous example, we scored all of those indicators using various metrics, and then we aggregated those. And the unique thing about this analysis was that we organized them and weighted them according to stakeholder values. So all of the stakeholder research that we did, we were able to infer and in some cases find direct information about what these stakeholders preferred. And the advantage of doing this type of analysis is that you can visualize those trade-offs within a given criteria. So whether it's resilience or economic vitality, you can see where one remediation alternative might provide a greater benefit in any one area over another. So that you know if you're selecting this one, you may be giving up a benefit that might have been achieved in cost effectiveness or habitat preservation by another alternative, but you might be gaining something else with that alternative. And understanding those trade-offs is very important in a balanced decision-making process. So shifting out of the kind of the remediation sustainability frameworks, but leading right into stakeholder communication. So as we started out at this presentation talking about different companies and how they're conducting their sustainability reporting and the different stakeholders that are involved in their reporting process, and how can we help the remediation process meet those objectives. This is kind of a framework of how we try to do that. We go through the sustainability analysis that we've just been through some options for, and we try to incorporate that into communication with the agencies, the regulators, and the policymakers. Those can also fit into a company's strategy. If the company is focused on waste and water consumption, we can focus on those metrics within the remediation program so that when we're evaluating remediation, it's reflecting the company's objectives in terms of sustainability. And so tailoring the remediation approach to meet the company's overall objectives. And you see which stakeholder issues are they considering? Those would be the criteria. What indicators are we using to evaluate those? Those are things like the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint, transparency, reputation, continuous improvement, human rights, and then taking actual metrics of how they're quantified. So the remediation examples I've provided are just one area where this type of reporting is conducted in this evaluation. Companies and organizations are using this framework to do their sustainability assessments and their materiality assessment of different sustainability issues and report those to their investors, to their insurers and their lenders, but also their customers and clients and communities in which they operate. One of the emerging topic areas is in climate-related disclosures. And you may have seen this in popular media over the last year and a half or so. But in March 2022, the SEC proposed rules related to climate disclosures that companies reporting to the SEC would need to report climate-related risks to the company and file those with the SEC. These rules, like I said, were proposed in March 2022, and there was a public comment period, which you can imagine. There was a lot of public comment on behalf of companies and lobbying organizations and individuals about how these rules would be implemented and the impacts they would have on businesses and the benefits to consumers and investors on learning this information about companies, and also the onus that's placed on the companies to comply with these reporting rules and the information they would need to develop and understand. So some of those disclosures on the explanatory side, looking at how their companies are governed, what are the climate-related risks, what is the impact on business from climate change impacts, and what is their process for risk management. Greenhouse gas emissions, the initial draft rules focused on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. which you may have some familiarity with. I have some backup slides on that if we'd like to get into that discussion. And on the financial side, what are the impacts of severe weather events on the company's financial statements? And what are the impact of transition activities? That would be energy transition on their financial statements. So transitioning from a carbon-based energy sources to renewables. The items that you see on the bottom of this chart are the more questionable. We don't know if scope 3 will be included in the final rules. But the publication of those final rules has been delayed a few times. The last update that I had seen published reported was that it was going to be April 2023, which came and went, and now some sources are saying that it will happen, that the final rules will be published in the fall of 2023 to go into effect in 2024. So this is something that a lot of geosyntax clients and companies across the board are going to be paying attention to and need to be aware of, and will need support in meeting these reporting requirements. And the intent is that that companies are being transparent, but also backing up claims that are made about their sustainability approaches. So a lot of companies have been accused of greenwashing, of making statements that are favorable to their investors or their customers or their shareholders, but then not providing the actual strategy internal of the company to meet those objectives or back up those claims. So the intent of these disclosures is to provide transparent, reliable information for investors to make decisions about financial risks. So just to wrap up our discussion, the sustainability assessments, especially in the remediation context, provide additional information and can help identify trade-offs to support a balanced decision-making process. The approach is adaptable to the availability of data, time, resources, expertise, the availability of tools in your toolbox. And often these tools can be used as communication approaches with stakeholders, so that you can share data about a project. You can be transparent about what options are being considered and what the trade-offs are associated with each of those options. And then, of course, finally, that sustainable remediation efforts are consistent with and can support corporate ESG objectives, especially focusing on indicators that are important to the organization responsible for that remediation. So with that, I'm happy to address questions here in this group. Khalid, I don't know if you have questions in the chat or if people come off mute themselves.
They will ask you. They will ask you directly. So
okay.
It was an excellent presentation. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Very